The Fantasy Animation Podcast is a completely independent production. It is made by experts in the field. Chris is a lecturer in liberal arts and visual cultures education at King's College London and author of The Computer Animated Film, available in all good bookshops. And I, Alex that is, am a senior lecturer in film and media studies at the University of Portsmouth and author of Encountering the Impossible, the fantastic in Hollywood fantasy cinema, available in even better bookshops. We do this podcast to provide audiences with an informative and hopefully entertaining guide through the ways in which you can not only enjoy fantasy and animation, but study it, examine it, explore it, and of course, make it and have a career in it. I hope you enjoy the show. Hello listeners and welcome to another episode of the Fantasy Animation Podcast. My name's Alex Sargent.
And I'm Chris Holliday.
Chris, we made a promise earlier in the year that we would get through some of these franchises eventually.
We did.
But we'll tick off another one on the list on the way today. So we're going to focus on Harry Potter and the Goblet of Fire, the fourth entry in the Harry Potter franchise. And we're going to try and talk about it in relation to, the elephant in the room, or the context in the text that is becoming increasingly kind of important to talk about, or almost unavoidable to talk about, which is the issue of Rowling as a public figure, and obviously some of the controversies surrounding her relationship, or indeed her lack of relationship, with the trans community and trans activism. So it's going to be an interesting one to talk through, because I think we haven't... It's always... What I like about doing these franchises in a way is that by finding a new way to talk about the films, we're almost kind of jumping, as well as jumping through the various entries in the franchise, we're jumping through the various critical lenses that you might look at this film through. So I'm kind of excited to see what we can get out of the Goblet of Fire by playing with some of these issues. How about you?
Yeah, well, it's a tricky one because, as you said, with these franchises, the risk is that we sort of repeat some of the same language and some of the... unless, of course, you're the Bond franchise, in which there's always something fresh and exciting and brand new to say. But with these ones, yeah, I mean, so I will say that the Harry Potter and the Goblet of Fire is my favourite of the Harry Potters, of the Harry Potter films, for lots and lots of reasons, which we will kind of go on to. But yeah, it's... I was going to make another James Bond analogy there. I think this is the franchise's Thunderball. It's the fourth one. It's doing something different. It's doing something that's... but I think it's expanding. One of the great things I think about this film is that it does a lot in terms of kind of world building and moving the world out sort of horizontally, which I quite like. And it's the one that I remember seeing and thinking, yeah, this is a really great movie in terms of this kind of characterizations, the fact that the children they're not just adult surrogates anymore, they're sort of being young adults, and the whole Yule Ball sequence, and the fact that it's set against the backdrop of a tournament. I think there's lots going on. It's kind of, and I believe it's one of the longest books. I think certainly there was a lot of effort to try and kind of narrow it down into one film. So I think that process of narrowing it down has made it quite taut and quite kind of economical. So yes, certainly my favourite, I think, of the Harry Potter. So I'm really excited to kind of talk about it. Plus there are dragons and there's some CGI stuff. So there we go.
Great. Well, you've got two Bond references already. I'll mention the Wizard of Oz off the front now, and then we can all just get on with our jobs, can't we? So yes, but luckily we are joined by a very special guest to help work our way through a lot of these issues. And that person is Taylor Driggers, who is the author of Queering Faith in Fantasy Literature, which was published by Bloomsbury in 2022, and was also a finalist for the 2023 Myopic Award in Myth and Fantasy Studies. Taylor's research examines how fantasy literature can reimagine the relationship between Christian theology, queer desire, and gendered embodiment, especially via the theologies of failure. Taylor is a member of the University of Glasgow Centre for the Centre for Fantasy and the Fantastic, as well as the HRC-funded research network Future Voices of Scottish Science Fiction and Fantasy, and holds a PhD in English Literature from the University of Glasgow. So, Taylor, thanks so much for coming on the podcast.
Hello, thank you so much for having me.
So, as listeners might have heard from that bio, you're very interested in the relationship between fantasy and queer representation, and indeed queer modes of reading. I think that's a useful way to start to think about some of the problem of Rowling, shall we put it that way. Before we get into Chris's favourite Harry Potter franchise entry, let's think about it a bit more generally to start us off. I'm sure listeners who are listening to this podcast probably know a decent enough about the background of what we're talking about here, but it might be worth setting the scene in terms of some of the problems or some of the issues around what it means to be a queer fan of fantasy, or indeed a sort of trans ally of fantasy, particularly this franchise, when there's all this context surrounding Rowling as a figure of a number of controversies. So do you want to just start us off there, and then we can move on to the film itself?
Sure. And I think first off here, I kind of want to preface what I'm about to say by kind of giving a little bit of background on where I'm coming to this conversation from. So I think first of all, important to what I'm about to say is just to note that I'm somebody whose own enthusiasm for fantasy was deeply, deeply formed by Harry Potter. I think from the ages of about, 10 years old until probably my early 20s, I pretty much ate, slept, and breathed Harry Potter. So this is, in many ways, a franchise that is sort of deep in my bones and is very, very formative for my own encounters with fantasy. It sort of was my springboard into other fantasy. But I'm also coming to this conversation as somebody who is in close community with a lot of trans people who are directly impacted by the money and resources and energy that J.K. Rowling is continuing to funnel into transphobic hate movements, I think particularly here in Scotland, where I'm based. So I think those two things in tension are kind of important to where I'm coming at this from. And I think often when the question is asked, how do we come to grips with enthusiasm for Harry Potter in the context of all the things that Rowling has been saying and doing in a very public sense in the past few years, I think sometimes it's very implicitly a question about how to maintain the same level of enthusiasm that we once had for the text. I think sometimes it can even take the form of asking permission to maintain that enthusiasm. And instead, I want to take a slightly different approach to that. And what I kind of want to focus on is to talk about how we can maybe listen to and be attentive to and respond to the discomfort that we might feel in light of that, and the discomfort that question arises out of. Because I think that sometimes that discomfort, it can be very tempting to kind of brush it aside. But sometimes it can also be instructive, and it can often be revealing of what we already feel is the responsible thing to do. I'm thinking a lot about in my research and a lot of just what I'm doing in my own academic work at the moment about endings and how we let go of particular worlds and how we come to grips with the end of things. And I think one of the responses that I think is important to consider is the possibility that we can let go of this world that has formed us, or at the very least hold it a little bit more lightly. And I think that comes out of my own experience of having once had enthusiasm for this franchise, for these books, for these films, but finding it increasingly difficult to come back to those in light of Rowling's actions, but also the impact that those actions are having on people close to me.
Yeah, I would say that. So thank you, Taylor. I think certainly within film studies, there's lots of instances where, and I think one of my students in group work one year did something about kind of the valuing, how we value and what do we value when we know certain things about the kind of creatives behind these kinds of processes. And of course, film studies certainly over the last few, or film, I would say, cinema. And film studies' response to cinema over the last few years, as a result of certain kinds of, the multiple reckonings, Me Too, Harvey Weinstein, so forth. There are instances where that question of how we can value the relationships that we have with art and the tenuousness. Or I think you said the way in which we need to let go of some of this stuff, or at least hold it slightly more with slightly less closed hands, and films in the cinema history is wrought with these sorts of stories, these kinds of figures, both in front of and behind the camera. Can we ever watch these films? I'm going to pull an example out of the air, but Woody Allen, probably a good example. Can we ever think about Woody Allen in the same way, or can we dislocate the art from the artist, and all these big kinds of questions? I suppose I'm based on what you said, I was thinking about. Maybe I know the answer to this, so it's a stupid question, but does it help when we're dealing with the films rather than the novels? Because is there a sense in which Rowling's proximity to the films is slightly different? Does that make these kinds of processes, I don't want to say easier, but different maybe? Because obviously she's firmly wedded. I think certainly when the films first came out, they were working on the books, and then am I right in saying that the films and I don't know whether were all the books released before the films? They weren't, were they? She was writing the film. Yeah, exactly. So she becomes more intimately connected with the film franchise and start. So I just wondered whether what your view is on sort of Rowling's role within the films, because they seem. I've tried quite hard to think about them as not J.K. Rowling products, because. And actually, a lot of adaptation studies would think through this. That turns out films are quite different than books, and so actually, Alex has got his hand up.
Well, just add a footnote to the question, and then Taylor, please, I'd like to hear what your response is. But it's also like it's easier, whether it should be, but it certainly instinctively feels easier to take Rowling out of the story because it's not literally the hand on the page kind of relationship. But at the same time, in terms of what you're talking about there, Taylor, in terms of just the material link of this, or the material effect of this, it is of course the multimedia franchise of Harry Potter that really stokes a lot
gives her the cash,
gives her the finances.
Right, yeah, and I think what you had to say about that, Alex, is absolutely correct. That there are actually almost two separate questions that we're dealing with here. That one of those questions is a question of interpretation, and the other question is a question of material ethics. And I think it is true and pertinent to. From an interpretive perspective, and obviously from an adaptation studies perspective especially, to treat these as separate texts, as their own entities with their own kind of complex authorship. And I think a little bit later we can maybe talk about some of the quite significant changes I think that this particular film makes to the way that Rowling presents gender, and particularly presents physical descriptions of characters relevant to gender. Within the novel Goblet of Fire, there's very significant changes that the film makes that I think are worth taking into account. At the same time, it's as Alex said, one of the concerns here is a material concern in terms of who's getting the royalties for this. I know this was something that was discussed a lot surrounding the release of Hogwarts Legacy, where the game studio that developed the game took great pains to distance the game from Rowling as a kind of creative persona. At the same time, we do still have to ask the extent to which she is materially benefiting in the form of royalties, even if she is minimally creatively involved. So there's a lot of complex questions there to kind of hold in tension. So on one level, it's not exactly easier, but definitely different when we think interpretively about these things. But when we kind of pivot towards the ethical questions surrounding them, that's where I think it still gets a lot more thorny.
I think to try and unpack some of these, so it sounds like so the conversation we've had so far has centered slightly on kind of the to kind of try and simplify it into a blunt question. It's something like the ethics of should I continue to purchase Harry Potter products, to which we've I think offered some answers there. I guess the next ethical question, which I suppose the rest of the podcast is devoted to, is given that I've already purchased Harry Potter products, what do I do with them now? And if I put on my DVD, I don't know why anyone under the age of 30 would put on a DVD, but if you were to put on my DVD of Goblet of Fire like I did last night in preparation for this podcast, what responsibilities, what things should I be considering, or indeed is there anything I should be considering, or are they just things that might be interesting to consider? So maybe we should move on and think about those things in relationship to Goblet of Fire. So I guess to set the story, if people don't already know, but again I think they probably do, we have the whole thing this time is that Harry's growing up a little bit, and I think we can get into exactly what that means in terms of the way it's represented in the story, in terms of he's becoming more aware of his sexuality, he's becoming early adolescent. We have the structure of this Triwizard Tournament, where Harry is mysteriously chosen as one of the competitors in this big Triwizard tri-school competition with various different set pieces that's kind of structure the movie. There are dragons, as Chris said, and there's also sort of more extension to the world building, right? We have new wizarding schools, we have new characters, so lots and of course the story itself pivots in this film, this book as well, whereby we get the return, spoiler alert, the return of Voldemort as a kind of as a physical antagonist, and the kind of, you know, the cliche darker turn of these story arcs as the thing gets on. So that's the kind of plot. Why don't we just sort of try and nimbly get through it, shall we? So we start with the beginning, where we get this kind of the traditional Hogwarts prologue. It's World Cup time, and the Quidditch World Cup is on. How did we feel about revisiting this sequence in terms of all the stuff we just talked about? Because what we have here, of course, is Rowling's depiction, perhaps for the first time, of the kind of global, or a hint towards a global wizarding world, including, you know.
Well, I'll jump in just because I think it goes back to your point, Tony, that you were talking about, like kind of J.K. Rowling's deep discomfort with bodies. I think one of the things, if these are characters that are finding their own, as you say, kind of Alex, they're finding their own kind of sexuality. One of my comments was Cho Chang discuss, because there's, and this is it is my favourite film, but there's a real uncomfortableness, I guess, with the way in which national identity and cultural specificity are being painted in quite generic and I don't know what the word is, Orientalist. Let's just call it Orientalist, kind of quite Orientalist terms. So I think that's. And I don't know whether that's a function. Well, I don't know what it's a function of, but certainly I think there's a. This is really. I think this is where the films start to embrace this idea of kind of world building. But an outcome of that is that you get identity. Like, you don't get fleshed out. The world is so centered on these three characters, on these three kids, that actually there isn't much space for other character development in lots and lots of ways. And so they end up being these kind of archetypes, or these really. What's the word? Kind of uncomfortable signifiers of different kinds of identity that are then, and even at the Yule Ball, you have those sort of twins that just basically bodies that seem interchangeable and sort of don't really have the nuance that Harry, Hermione, and Ron have. So I don't know. It's one of those films where, I appreciate. I mean, as I said, I really like it. I think it's actually the darkest. Actually, a lot of stuff is written about how the third film is dark, and we've talked about this on the podcast previously. I find this one incredibly dark, and more so than the. So I like that element of it, and I think the world building and the way that it uses all of its different spaces and set pieces as well. But there is this undercurrent of Rowling not really knowing how to write different kinds of characters, and so defines them in very, I don't know whether it's the same in the book, but defines them in these very broad sort of, and then we have the French team, and then we have the the Eastern Europeans, and then we have and it's like, oh, so we're just going to do that then, and we're just going to, that's really what French students are like? Okay, fine, we're going to, so that's where the. So I don't know. That's my initial sort of.
I'm glad you brought that up, because that was actually one of the thoughts that I had as well, in kind of thinking about this film through the lens of gender, and particularly kind of where, as you said, the kind of broader attempts to gesture towards internationalism in this film, kind of intersects with the treatment of gender in the film as well, and the fact that we have three characters actually who are Asian women who. Are essentially positioned by the film kind of as props for Ron and Harry in particular, to kind of bounce off of. And none of them, and I feel for the actors playing them as well, because they aren't given much to do
No.
performance-wise. We don't really get much of a sense of interiority for them. They really are sort of at best objects of desire, and definitely, you were talking about kind of not being sure how the extent to which that translates to the novels. I think one of the interesting things about the novel that has been sort of much discussed is Rowling's seeming insistence on writing out foreign accents phonetically, which we definitely see with characters like Fleur Delacour and Victor Crumb within the text. And yeah, it does contribute to this overall simultaneous attempts to flesh out the world, but maybe not as much of an attempt to flesh out the actual characters themselves. There is this sort of flattening of non-British wizarding cultures that are presented in the text.
Yeah, and I think that their use as props, I think, is particularly important, because this is like their use in the film, or their role in the film, their narrative role in the film, is like the white racial frame sort of par excellence, because they are as props. They're also seemingly less so with Cho Chang, but the twins are certainly positioned as like alternatives, like not the girls that they really wanted to go with, but the sort of the B team, the backup, and contrast that to the way the film then frames Hermione. She enters into the hall, into the Yule Ball and stuff like that. So I agree that they are positioned in that they are gestures, as you said, towards this kind of international, that the world of Harry Potter extends beyond the core group of British actors that have basically constituted the first three films. And actually there's a real sense in which this is part of, this is what I mean about kind of fleshing out the world and building the world in quite interesting ways. And yet at the same time, the constituent parts of that world are often painted with this very broad brush that are gestures to an international set of identities, but actually seem to fall on the same old of kind of.
Well, one of the things that I noticed, and this is kind of a bridge between that conversation about the kind of broadening of the world and gender, but one adaptational choice that I think is worth noting that is not present in the novel is the decision to kind of over-determine the French and the Eastern European wizarding schools in terms of gender, which is actually something that the novel doesn't do at all. In the novel, both Beauxbatons and Durmstrang are presented as co-ed schools, whereas here, when we see the entrance of the different schools, the French wizarding students are so hyper feminized and so just completely these objects of desire. And there's even one particular shot where we are seeing it. I think it's meant to be from Ron's perspective, and we just see the shot of all their butts as they're sort of sashaying down the Great Hall, and so it's they're hyper feminized in this very cartoonish way, and then the students from Durmstrang similarly are sort of hyper masculinized, and it's an interesting choice in that, obviously, as we've been saying, this is a very long novel that the filmmakers are trying to distill into a 2.5-hour film. And so it seems like one of the pieces of visual shorthand that they've landed on is to actually attach gendered valences to the different wizarding schools that we're seeing. So that was something that particularly stood out to me on this rewatch. Again, thinking about it through that lens.
So, but what does that mean then? I guess, what does that mean in terms of thinking about the way that the film, as you said, those gendered valences within this process of becoming, how the film does that feed into the way that the films themselves treat. There are bodies that the films don't know that they don't know what to do with. We're much more comfortable with a Victor Crumb or a Delacour. Like, we're much more comfortable with understanding. Like the film constructs its world that the characters are more comfortable with characters that they can recognise through these gendered valences. when you get the kind of queer bodies, you get bodies, and of course Voldemort, of course, and even in the first film, you have Voldemort stuck to the back of what's his face, that professor
Quirrell.
Quirrell, yeah. So the franchise itself doesn't really know what to do with bodies that don't fit, and even characters that we consider sort of who don't dip in and out of the films, who don't then disappear and we never see them again. So even characters like Neville, and I would say the Dursleys as well fit into this. That the films almost feel like they feel like they need to be, or the only way to be on safer ground is to sort of cast these or create these roles that are very, as you said, that are filtered through these very clearly defined kind of gender markers, and there is no time. There's no time that the films have, and it's a classic Hollywood thing of like Hollywood and villainy and queerness, and not really knowing what to do with queer bodies, whether you're Peter Lorre or whether you're whatever. I don't know, Neil Patrick Harris in Gone Girl, and I'm so thrilled that he was not made the villain of the piece. But there are certain ways in which Hollywood doesn't really know what to do with these bodies, of course, and I felt like that with the Harry Potter films, that it uses this Triwizard Tournament to establish quite clearly defined. This is what's going to happen. This is just a very clearly constructed world that Harry has to move through. And yet there are moments where there are characters where the film's like, I don't really know what to do with these characters. They're either the villains or I'm going to expel them. And we need to use this film to shore up Harry's kind of masculinity in two ways. One, because there's a rivalry with Ron that we haven't really had before. And then there's also a kind of, his relationship with Cho Chang, the question of desire in relation to Hermione. So the film's trying to do a lot for shoring up. It doesn't account for basically non-normative subject positions. So I'm just trying to think through some of these things, because it's more than just that this film is doing things with gender and doing things with the young children as they ascend to adulthood, that they're no longer children trying to work their way through an adult world, but looking after and protecting each other. They're not... There's something else. They're on the cusp of something else, and I don't quite know how to kind of reconcile that in the film with, Alex, you look pained.
I have one of these thoughts I'm going to squeeze out that I probably am going to regret saying.
We'll cut it out, or we'll make it the 10-second snippet that adverts the show.
Yeah, what I'm trying to do in this conversation is I'm thinking about that dilemma I've posed of. What do I do with the DVD now I own it? And it seems to me that there are two, I would argue, fairly legitimate responses to that. And I'm seeing if we can try and articulate both as we go here. The first is now that I have this context surrounding the author of this text that I once held as beloved, will that give me an invite to find things in it that I hadn't found before that are worth scrutinising and problematising? I think that's a very legitimate response to it. I guess the other legitimate response to it is to say, in terms of empowering communities, which fandom can do, right? Fandom can empower minority communities through a mode of self-expression through its kind of its kind of communal ability. So is the other valid response, I think, is to go, well fuck Rowling, like not as an excuse for the film, but almost to kind of like perform a reading that deliberately kind of takes the text away from her, right? In the same way you can take away the Wizard of Oz. I said I'd get another reference in. You can take the Wizard of Oz away from all the deeply problematic cisgendered white men who made it and turn it into an incredibly important queer text. It's kind of can you take the text away from these problematic authors and make it yours? And so I'm just seeing if I can find ways to do that. And I think there's something interesting in this movie about... Well, there might be. This is why there's something about the role of spectacle in this movie. Because, Chris, you said that these films don't know what to do with these bodies. Actually, up until now, they do know what to do with them, which is to make them a source of the abject. That's what they do. Through the mode of spectacle that they present, they make them sources of the abject. And that doesn't stop here, but quite a lot of the first three movies are Harry, Ron, and Hermione staring at disgusting things, in quotation marks. This movie, because Harry's growing into the role of the kind of action hero, with gendered terms used deliberately. Part of the process of identification and process of the spectacle is that we're supposed to identify with Harry in all these spectacular set pieces, and the other characters fighting at the same time are this hyper-masculine Victor Crumb, this ultra-feminine Fleur de Coeur, and Cedric, who's
he's a nice
Victor
boy.
Crumb, diet Victor Crumb, right? You know, like nice boy, but certainly we're not. He's still seen as this kind of figure of idealization, right? It's there are four. I guess I'm interested in the fact that there are four locuses of action in these set pieces. 3 of them are idealized to the point of which you can't really identify with them, and one of them is Harry. And there's something interesting about that. That actually, as much as we're talking about these kind of really encoded gender dynamics, those figures are not the figures that we're identifying with, I guess, is the kind of blunt, boring way of bringing back to this. Having said all of that, I am aware that I've just said Harry is now this figure of kind of subversive identity, which he quite clearly isn't. So, but I don't know. Does anyone want to play with any of those garbled thoughts?
The thing that you were saying about spectacle kind of made me think about how, just by framing the narrative of this film through the Triwizard Tournament, the film is kind of inviting us to think about spectacle and is kind of foregrounding the concept of spectacle. And so if we're maybe aiming to do a reparative reading of the text, I think that might be where we could start with that it is kind of because the spectacle is being so foregrounded, you know, and we're seeing so many scenes where the action scenes are literally being watched by people in stands. We actually do have an audience that is present within the film. I don't quite know what to do with that, but I'm thinking about that now in terms of
I can't. Are there any Quidditch? There isn't any Quidditch sequences in this.
No, it's so bizarre that we have the introduction of the World Cup, and yet that scene is completely excised.
Right.
Yeah,
interesting, because that's how the first 3 films, right? Is that the big spectacular moments of the films are these Quidditch sequences, right? Which are in the books, but they're kind of much more kind of narrativized in the books. They're just these kind of big set pieces in the films, right? And so I guess what's interesting is that in the first 3 movies we get these kind of big, as you say, Taylor, foregrounded moments of spectacle with literally audiences watching on, and then you get these kind of, I don't know, like the battle with the troll in the bathroom, or the journey into the Chamber of Secrets, which are big set pieces, but they're for want of a better word, private between Harry and the monsters he's fighting, or this kind of stuff. Here, other than that final battle with Voldemort, which is, you know, which has that quality, and that becomes an important plot point, right? Every other, it's like the 2 things have been folded together. Everything becomes a thing that is watched by other people, and becomes, as you say, this really, self-conscious moment of display, and it's not just that, actually. It's the ball is like this as well, right? The ball is this other, like, a spectacular display of bodies, of gendered bodies and things like that. So, yeah, I don't know, Chris, spectacle. What should we throw at this to make it work?
But I think it's to do with the, you know, it's the 4th film in the franchise. So the first 2 are quite similar. The 3rd film is different, but sort of the same. And I like the idea of kind of private spectacle that is very much rooted in the fact that these are 3 characters who are moving through a school that they don't quite understand, are encountering all these things to get to something. And often it involves the guest star of that particular film, right? We get it. I get what's happening. The Defense Against the Dark Arts teacher is the poison chalice, because whoever comes in and plays that role will probably be involved in some way. So anyway, this film is like, so I like the idea that it opens out the spectacle to everybody, so everybody in the film can kind of see what the fuss is about that we've all enjoyed as spectators for the first 3 movies. So now we're all enjoying the spectacle of Harry Potter. It'd be interesting to know, I don't know when this, there's a sort of theme parky quality, and I don't know when the first sort of Harry Potter experiences began to open up, or people were thinking about this as a spectacle for the public. But it'd be interesting to figure out if this is 2005 and the highest grossing film of 2005 as well. it's doing something with the spectacle of Harry Potter, generally speaking, and then it's then staging that spectacle back to the characters and going, this is the video game level with the dragon, this is the video game, with the egg, and this is the video game level here, and this is the underwater thing with the gillyweed, and this is the bit in the video game where you touch the port key and get sent miles away. So that it's almost staging. It's almost like 4 films in, it's the greatest hits of Harry Potter as we've had so far, bringing in all of these. And the other thing is that it doesn't really have, as you were talking, Alex, I was thinking about the idea of the villain. And actually, this film spends a long time not really having a villain because of the fact that it's set against the backdrop of a tournament. So, damn it, the villains they're just fighting with themselves. They're just trying to better themselves, these things. They're kind of competing against each other, which is very, very different. And it's only at the end of this film where the 3 characters kind of say, everything will change. Voldemort's back. And then that sets the second half of the franchise off and running, where we're back to more familiar, formulaic territory. So the Triwizard Tournament seems to kind of flatten out the film. This is a moment of reflection in the franchise. We're reflecting. These are all the bits of the franchise that work really well together. I still think it's the darkest one, because I think when Cedric Diggory dies, I think that's one of the most... Because his father, my part like that is... absolutely heartbreaker. So, but this is an interesting kind of pause for the franchise, but it seems to be reflecting back the spectacle of Harry Potter within the film itself. So now, as I said, the characters in the film can really enjoy what all this fuss was about.
That scene that you were talking about of Cedric's death, and particularly once they come back into the stadium after the fight with Voldemort, I think. First of all, it is one of the darkest scenes, I think, in the entire franchise, just because of the way that it's acted and the way that it's shot and directed. But I think it's also instructive in a way for thinking about the way that spectacle is positioned in the film, because when they use the port key to get back to the stadium, there's this triumphant cheer that comes up, but before everyone realizes what has happened. And I find that so interesting in terms of thinking about ourselves as the audience kind of being mirrored within that scene. That this is something that we're kind of cheering on and kind of enjoying, and yet the stakes of it are absolutely gut-wrenching for the characters involved. I also think it's interesting, you mentioned them kind of vying with themselves, and I think that ties into what's maybe one of the biggest adaptational changes in this film, which is that the maze is completely different in the way that it's presented. In the novel, the maze has all of these different very real, very magical obstacles. There's a Sphinx whose riddles Harry has to answer at one point. And obviously, on the one hand, in the film, none of that is present, and instead what they're told is that they're essentially facing themselves in the maze. They're facing their own sort of competitiveness, it seems. The maze seems to be working on them in some ineffable kind of way. And obviously, from a very pragmatic perspective, it's to do with budget constraints. Obviously, it's a lot less expensive to film somebody's internal conflict than it is to present a giant sphinx in the middle of the maze. But then it's also really interesting in terms of first having this spectacular battle with a dragon, and then this having to rescue somebody you care about from the merman, and then having the maze there is really interesting, because it almost deconstructs that notion of navigating the school as being these spectacular battles that we're seeing. Instead, we're seeing characters who are left with nothing but themselves, and what that does to them in that context.
I was just going to ask. Actually, I was going to ask Alex, because you said, Alex, that about the film up to this point doesn't really know, or I said that it doesn't really know what to do with bodies, and you said it does, and it makes them a spectacle. So is this film different then? Because the first 3, it does things with a Pettigrew, or it does things with a Quirrell, and this film feels different in that sense.
Potentially, I think where my mind goes when you say that is actually this film seems a little bit more interested in spectacularizing positive, there's some more air quotes, bodies than negative bodies. And I think... I'm
kind of heroic bodies, maybe.
Yeah, well, yeah, that's it.
Yeah.
Exactly it. It's interested in the issue of a heroic body. That's exactly it. And I think, having posed this question about spectacle and thinking it through, one of the ways in which I've approached spectacle is to think about kind of idealization, right? Is that and particularly spectacle's relationship to fantasy is this kind of idea of idealization. When one idealizes something by spectacularizing it, they're kind of doing two things at once. They're creating something that they cannot be. There could be something politically subversive about that. So the film is acknowledging that we, the viewer, through the lens of Harry, cannot be Victor Crumb, Fleur de Coeur, Cedric. We cannot be these people. But then it also gives us a kind of structure by which we can want to be. Yeah, so Harry cannot be Victor. He's not masculine enough. He's not strong enough. But he can want to be that strong. And in a way, and we can want Harry to be that strong. And in a way, that's what the film determinizes, right? Is that by the end of it, and I'm just struck that the Cedric bit is incredible, and it's probably the most harrowing sequence in the entire franchise. And I'm just struck quite obviously, and is by that phrase, my boy. Is it's that he's returned. The crowd are cheering. They're expecting a champion. They're expecting, and it's this kind of, it's this, completely castrated, for to kind of use psychoanalytic terminology, body. This limp, dead figure of virality that makes it all the more harrowing to Harry and all the more harrowing to his father, right? It's this figure of idealization has now been dead, and there's this implicit assumption that this is what Harry needs to be. Harry needs to be the hero, and by hero, the film by then has determined what he needs to. He needs to do the stuff that he does in every movie. He needs to run harder, jump faster, fight more, be braver, because it's not really interested in Harry learning more spells. It's not really interested in Harry using his cerebral qualities. That's very much determined as a feminine, or it's given to the feminine space in the role of Hermione. Harry's not going to defeat Voldemort by... It seemed like that would be quite a wise thing to do. I've always wondered why on earth that's never why doesn't Harry spend more time learning anything, given that he's about to battle the greatest wizard that's ever been? But maybe that's the academic in me. Do the reading, but he's not interested in that. He's good at using his wits. He's good at thinking on his feet. He's
So do you think the decision then to have... I mean, obviously, I'm assuming this is in the novel, as in I haven't read the novel, but given that it's Cedric's the kind of body that the film franchise has told us that have been relatively kind of infallible, because even the ghosts are white, really. The majority of ghosts are white, I would just say, certainly in Hogwarts. And so this is the kind of body that we expect... Going back on what you said, that we expect to return to the fold as the hero, and you have this sort of this limp young white boy who so very easily could have been Harry, and I think you're right that the sort of choice to have my boy rather than my son is quite interesting, but because these are also just boys. But it struck me that it's an unusual moment in the franchise because he's like a human boy. He's not a Pettigrew, or he's not a Quirrell, or he's not somebody who is kind of tainted and informed and created and constructed, even at the level of the production of the film through effects. He's just like a boy, and that's what makes it, and a white boy. Anyway,
we've talked about the main plot. Maybe we could talk about women. We've already alluded to it, but the subplot, which seems kind of so rife for thinking through some of these issues in terms of gendered identity in the movie, which is that at the same time all these big spectacular feats are happening, and Voldemort is plotting. The kids are getting older, and they're starting to date, and there's this that kind of plays itself out throughout the film. But the kind of big set piece around that is this ball where they've all got to bring a date, and it's it's prom, it's whatever national construct one uses to throw into that. It's that they're all going to get dressed in their robes, and people are worrying about whether their hand-me-down robes are too much and all this sort of stuff. I'd like to obviously talk about the ball itself, and particularly Hermione's positioning in that, and the way gender plays out in that. But is there anything anyone wants to say about the kind of build up to the ball, the way these characters are announced as as sexual beings, I guess, as much as anything else?
I think Ron is really interesting in the entire Yule Ball subplot. I think, first of all, for the ways in which he is completely helplessly infatuated with Fleur Delacour, which I think, in the novel has the broader context of Fleur being descended from the Vila, which are these kind of monstrous feminine figures of seduction, which obviously plays into the very overt heterosexuality of Rowling's world building once again. In the novel, we get this scene where a lot of the male characters in the series encounter the Vila, and they're all just sort of helplessly entranced. And it is this very simplistic depiction of desire and positioning men as sort of absolute slaves to their lusts and their sexual desires. So that's interesting because that context is excised from the film, but we still do get a little bit of that where Ron is sort of recounting his asking Fleur to the ball, and Ginny at one point I think says actually he sort of screamed at her. It was really frightening. So again, this idea of desire, and particularly I think teenage desire, as something that is just sort of uncontrollable and ineffable, and almost has as much sway over somebody as literal magic does, where in the novel the magic is literal. Here it's not necessarily positioned as literal, but still it doesn't lose any of that potency. But I'm also thinking about Ron's dress robes in particular, and his relationship to his hand-me-down dress robes, because obviously the way that Ron's dress robes are played for comedy, a lot of the humor is rooted in the way that the robes seem to cross gender lines. And at one point, I think he even says, "I look like my great aunt Tessie." So he's naming that that instance of he's embarrassed because he looks like a woman, and he looks like an old woman at that. I think the implication is. So that's interesting, kind of positioned in the context of this. Again, I think we can say very heterosexual spectacle of the Yule Ball, and here Ron is the odd one out. He feels like the odd one out because he is not able to perform gender correctly in this context. And it's interesting as well the way that inability to perform gender correctly is linked to his economic status. These are hand-me-down robes that are sort of an outmoded fashion for wizards' robes.
The thing with the so the notes that I've got on the Yule Ball are kind of both the ball and the tournament, based on what you're saying, kind of are there to sort of expose different kinds of relationships, sort of. Professional, i.e. different kinds of questions of desire in the pursuit of a particular mission, let's say, or task within the tournament. And then the ball brings out, as you said, like a different side to Harry, particularly Ron. So a lot of stuff on the ball is about, okay, this is a space of socializing, but it's also set against the backdrop of a tournament where the same figures are. It's like about partnering up, different kinds of partnering and different kinds of coupling up, and there's no need for the love spells that would be elsewhere in the franchise. This is sort of love spells but played for real, basically. Also, as you were writing, I wrote down, rather than a heterosexual spectacle, I wrote down the ball as heterospectacle. So I don't really know what I mean by that, but that feels
new
like
term coins.
New term. But it made me think of the sort of the teen movies of the 2000s, given that this is 2005 and the sort of 90s and into the 2000s, so a lot of the 90s teen movies were adaptations of classic literature. You've got your 10 Things I Hate About You, and you've got your Clueless and all that kind of stuff. Then in the 2000s, you've got, and I don't know whether this is kind of true, but it feels like a lot of, I don't know, there are more films that are about female anxiety, so like Mean Girls, than there are masculine anxiety. And what I like about the scene in this film is that there's a sort of there's moments where it lapses into like a high school or like a teen comedy, but it's entirely. It's the female characters are maybe this isn't true, but the female characters feel kind of removed from the chaos, and it's all about this kind of masculine. It's very. I think Superbad was like this. Like Superbad, it feels like it's about the masculine anxiety in a way that we've gone from Mean Girls and we've gone away from the female rivalry of teen movies. We're back more towards your Road Trips or your American Pie. So I was just trying to think about whether or not the teen movies of the 2000s are sort of, this is the moment where they come into collision with fantasy, and you've got this sort of like, I don't know. It's like the British version of trying to do an awkward American teen movie. I don't know, but I don't know. That's what made me.
I mean, Chris. First off, this is why I love doing podcasts with you. Is that just when I think I know what you're going to say, you're going to bring in the context of '90s teen movies to help diagnose some of the issues in this film.
Sure.
But now you've done it. It's She's All That, isn't it?
Yeah.
The moment that
Yeah,
that Hermione
Hermione
arrives and walks down. Literally, it's even staged exactly the same. It's She's All That. It's the moment where the quote-unquote nerd, I really am using my air quotes today, takes off the glasses and reveals the supermodel beneath. Yeah. And there is one slight difference, and I think remembering the two sequences, it's been a while since I've watched She's All That, I must confess. But the two sequences is that at least the Harry Potter version gives a certain recognition to her own discomfort, her own unease at being the object of display. But other than that, it is She's All That, and I wonder if it's worth at least touching on a very uncomfortable aspect of this, which is that we're talking about Emma Watson as well as a star here, and I'm literally trying to Google in the background how old she is. When this movie comes out. But this is very much within the era, certainly in the UK, of, the countdown to Charlotte Church's 16th birthday in tabloid presses.
She's 15. Yeah. She's 15.
And things like that. And there is something, well, there's, we wouldn't be able to do justice and deal with enough sensitivity to really delve into it much, but there's something about the enunciation on screen of Hermione as woman playing into a kind of star discourse of Emma Watson's growing maturity that is very uncomfortable. I think it's probably all I'm going to be able to say about that and do it any justice. But I think you're right to compare it to stuff like that, because she is an object of spectacle in that moment. Not unlike Fleur de Coeur and the bum shot at the beginning. For Ron, and it's interesting that Ron is the character that mediates all this, because you're right, Taylor. He's always the character that does masculinity. He never gets it right, but he's also allowed to be far more lustful than say Harry by a comparison. Harry quietly pines for Ginny for about 6 movies, and then kind of kisses her twice. Ron, and it's Ron. He's falls in love with a creature of magical things. Is it in the next book and film that he's literally given a love potion?
I think it's Half-Blood Prince. Yeah, he's given a love potion.
So there's this kind of weird, like his sexuality is so lustful to border on supernatural. Indeed, it has to kind of find ways to make it supernatural, to make it okay,
to make it palatable, almost.
To make it palatable. Yeah. Very interesting. Yeah. But then we get this moment of Hermione where really we're taking on the figure of Ron there to look at the display of a 15-year-old girl. To use. Yeah. Want a better language.
The only thing I'd add to that is, so The Sun did similarly and this was part of the kind of Leaveson inquiry of The Sun and the Sunday Sport, doing these countdowns. So it was Emma Watson. There was a countdown to her 16th birthday, which would have been at the time she filmed this, she's 14. The film comes out when she's 15. The only other thing I'd add is that Emma Watson was one of the first stars to be the subject of sort of digital deepfake pornography. And it's really interesting that it happens to be her, and whether or not you want to trace a through line between this sequence and 13 years later, 12 years later, 13 years later, where you have these deepfake, there are certain kinds of star bodies to which that digital kind of enhancement and mediation through the computer grading suite were being subject to, and it still remains Scarlett Johansson and Emma Watson and Daisy Ridley, and there's a kind of group of young stars to which this technology has often been kind of connected to. And I think last week there was a new video, a deepfake video of Scarlett Johansson, and she's now basically taking legal action against an app to sort of say my likeness is my own. And obviously these are bigger questions around the star as a data asset and who owns the star body, but I'd not really thought about that. First of all, that link to She's All That, and I know exactly the bit you mean now, I'd forgotten I'd seen that. I mean, let's not pretend we don't watch it all the time, but I also haven't seen it in a long time, Alex. But I know exactly the bit that you mean, which doesn't come too much after to this. And of course there are two different kinds of teen movies. There's of course the masculine anxiety and then the female sort of rivalry thing, and this is clearly the former. But the fact that it's Emma Watson, what the film's doing as part of this, that taps into a broader treatment of her kind of becoming, is definitely problematic. But she's also somebody that's been subject to these kinds of digital technologies in ways that aren't kind of entirely palatable, let's say.
I think it's also interesting, and again, thinking about this as an adaptation, the different ways that scene reads in the novel versus the film, and part of this is just by virtue of the fact that it is Emma Watson, but in the novel, we're given to understand that Hermione is completely unrecognizable in this moment. In the film, it's very clearly just Emma Watson with an updo, so it kind of loses a bit of that kind of shocking transformation moment, but then it does become differently positioned, as you've been saying, when we contextualize it in this kind of broader media narrative of Emma Watson and this kind of prurient fascination with the development of the maturing of underage female celebrities.
I'll ask what else there is to talk about in the movie, because where we should stop it running up. I want to just very quickly, because I've remembered that there's a really great not to plug another podcast, but there's a really good the Katrina Longworth's You Must Remember This, the film history podcast. Has just done a really great series about 1990s sex culture in the films and talking about the figure of the Lolita. And I think if anyone's interested in more information and context about this, I would invite them to go and listen to those episodes, because they'll do it much more nuance than we've got time to here. Shall we go past the Yule Ball? What else is left on our notes list? Because we're starting to kind of run out of time now. So, Taylor.
I wanted to talk a little bit about Rita Skeeter, just kind of linking it to these questions we were discussing at the beginning of the podcast. Because, again, I think this is a case where interesting adaptational choices have been made, and I think in this case it's a choice to actually soften some of what we might object to, especially retrospectively in the novel. So Rita Skeeter, who is obviously the kind of tabloid journalist who is following around all of the Triwizard champions in both the novel and the film. When we meet her in the novel, she's described in an incredibly grotesque way. And I think if there's any particular body that the text, that this particular text has a particular kind of anxiety towards, in the novel, it's definitely Rita Skeeter. And in particular, I'm not going to repeat the description verbatim, but she is essentially described in a way that kind of highlights a disjuncture with regard to her gendered presentation. There's a lot of fixation on her hands being very large and having a strong grip in a way that kind of suggests masculinity in some way. And in particular, I think this passage reads as very, very fraught in light of Rowling's kind of broader stance on trans issues. And it also very closely parallels a similar description that the transphobic feminist writer Germaine Greer writes. I think it's in her book The Whole Woman, but in that book, Greer similarly describes a trans woman in ways that kind of highlight what she perceives as the kind of grotesque disjuncture between gendered attributes and gendered presentation. And I think it's incredibly interesting, especially regarding the fact that in the novel, Rita Skeeter is revealed to be a shapeshifter. And Hermione kind of undergoes this entire quest over the course of the novel to expose Rita Skeeter as an unregistered animagus. So not only is she a shapeshifter, she's somebody whose shapeshifting kind of eludes the gaze of the law and of official institutions. And this plot of kind of unmasking or revealing, I think, is something that is incredibly integral to transphobic narratives of identity. This kind of mantra that a lot of transphobic campaigners will say that, oh, we can always tell. I think it's interesting then that the film kind of excises all of that stuff regarding Rita Skeeter. She's just sort of a tabloid journalist, and she is. I think she's costumed, and I think Miranda Richardson sort of plays her in a way that is sort of hyper feminine in a way, but it's different than the sort of grotesque femininity that we see depicted in the novel. And I also, I think, just as another addendum to that, I think it's incredibly interesting, and it makes her a very confused figure, that in the novel she's simultaneously meant to be this kind of satire on tabloid journalism. And then fast forward to 2023, and tabloid journalism has been one of the driving forces in kind of perpetuating a lot of transphobic discourse and transphobic narratives within the British press, especially. So that's all incredibly fraught, and one of the things that I think really stands out about the text in retrospect. But again, interesting that even in 2005, there seems to have been a very conscious choice made to move away from that characterization, and to move away from that way that she's presented in the text.
That's really interesting. I didn't realize that was the kind of discrepancy between the book and the film. And actually, as you were talking, as you say, that split or that dissonance between gendered attributes and gendered presentation, the way that or that sort of the way in which that's framed by people like Grit, it reminds me of when I've taught kind of trans studies and kind of the transgender tipping point. There's often this idea of kind of the trap of the visual, and exactly as you're saying, these discourses of authenticity. Hashtag we can always tell, the relationship between kind of the relationship that trans bodies have to deceit, that they are concealing under the kind of the guise of trying to assimilate. How dare they? Passing and fooling and all the language around trans identities and how the signs, like, quote unquote, how we're supposed to know. We can always this sort of hiding in plain sight trap of the visual. That there's something quite interesting about the way that you've described Rita Skeeter's like the fact that there's this whole plot about her trying to be unmasked, but it made me think of all the times in the Harry Potter franchises. What's worse than being an animagus? Well, being an unregistered, as we know, there are so many people in this country that are supposed, even though it's impossible for humans to be illegal, you cannot be illegal. There are illegal and there are illegal people living here and so forth, and so it's sort of this rhetoric of this rhetoric of authenticity and that, and also part of that is that visibility therefore breeds violence. So we're in the height, and a lot of writers around within trans studies would say. Raina Gossett, Eric Stan, and Joanna Burton in an introduction to a book called Trapdoor: Transcultural Production and the Politics of Visibility say we are living in a time of trans visibility, yet we're also living in a time of anti-trans violence. Consequently, you come to this project with a deep sense of possibility that also exists in an interval of anxiety. And it seems like a lot of a lot of, maybe this, I don't know whether this is true of all, like a lot of fantasy movies, but the idea of kind of unmasking and finding out your true, that you're pretending to be something else. And of course you get that with your Pettigrews, you get it with Barty Crouch, you get it with the sort of even somebody.
Even the character of Umbridge, I mean, it's different movie, different book, but given on this subject, there's again the same link between this kind of ultra femininity and masking a form of deception, right? Umbridge is eerily evil, and she masks her true intentions through this display of over the top pink femininity. Yeah, interesting.
And I think it's important to link that back to the earlier conversation about the anxiety that these films have around bodies, that we are often seeing our kind of normatively bodied main characters kind of gawking at quite grotesque figures, and linking that to the idea, and I think this is something that Jules Gill-Peterson has talked about a lot in her work, that often trans people are an object that is looked at, and that is one of the traps of visibility, even post tipping point. That the tipping point kind of didn't resolve that fundamental issue of still being the object that is looked at, whether from a bigoted perspective or from a nominally positive perspective of representation. It's very, very rare that you see a trans subject as a producer of knowledge, as somebody who can make an account of themselves from their own perspective. And so I think that's really, really relevant to bring up. Again, kind of circling back to this notion of spectacle and the ways in which this film is in some ways very conscious of itself as spectacle, but in other ways is potentially less conscious of the kind of spectacularizing discourses that it's bound up with.
That kind of this is one of these ways we bring the conversation to an end, I guess. But like that's kind of the classic adage of fantastical texts, right? Is that quite often by displaying some elements of phantasm, it shores up other aspects of its own fictionality as being kind of feeling more normal or real. And I think there's a play with spectacle on that. The things that seem the most magical and imaginative in the movie are shore up things that feel most normal, and that's kind of one of the effects these texts have, right? Is that whilst they display these magical worlds which readers want to jump into, the characters they're being asked to jump in there with and see their way through become really embedded within structures of identity. They become and become so easy to take for granted as equally fabulous, and I mean that in the kind of true sense of the word, rather than in the kind of into the kind of modern day usage, truly fabulous creatures as much as any dragons or monsters or anything else that might be represented. So yeah, that might be a good way of rounding off the conversation. Okay, yes,
absolutely.
So yeah, I mean, we touched the surface, but we explore the ideas and people are free to respond, I think. But a really productive conversation, I think. And Taylor, thanks very much for joining us for it.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been really fun and illuminating, and I'm now having lots of new thoughts that are different from the thoughts that I brought to this conversation, which is great.
Great. Stick that in an iTunes review, and that would be perfect.
You are shameless. Taylor, you are shameless.
Speaking of shamelessness, Taylor, you have a book. Tell us all about it. The book is fabulous. I've read it. It's a wonderful, and once I read it, I thought I need to get Taylor on the show. It's Queering Faith in Fantasy Literature. For listeners who might be interested in it, can you give us the synopsis? What's it about?
Yeah, so the book is basically kind of the fruits of my attempts to kind of think through how we can maybe kind of synthesize a dialogue between this very strong strand of religious readings of fantasy in one sense, and this kind of this way of allying fantasy with the queer or the abject or the strange. On the other hand, so it's all kind of about how fantasy can allow us to rewrite religious traditions. I particularly focus on Christianity within the text because that is the sort of theological tradition that was very foundational to me, and that I, in many ways, still inhabit. But it's about how we can sort of reimagine theology and reimagine religious traditions from specifically queer and otherwise gender marginalized positionalities. So in the book, I talk about texts like The Left Hand of Darkness by Ursula Le Guin, The Passion of New Eve by Angela Carter. I also touch on Le Guin's Earthsea series, speaking of wizard schools. And I also talk about Till We Have Faces, which is a novel by C.S. Lewis that is sort of a retelling of the Eros and Psyche myth. And essentially, the question that I'm asking throughout the book is, can we inhabit these religious discourses in ways that might lead toward queer liberation? And what are some of the ways in which fantasy can do that? Because fantasy is obsessed with the other and the strange and the non-normative. Are there productive ways that we can inhabit that sort of unsettle the very staid understandings of religious orthodoxy that we might inhabit?
Yeah, it's a fascinating read. I encourage.
I was going to say it's up right up your street, Alex. I know full well.
So many keywords. Yeah. No, it's a really great book. So people can find it out there, available for purchase. I do encourage you to do it, or indeed, if you have purchasing powers in your institution, get it on those reading lists.
Absolutely.
Otherwise, yes, Taylor, thanks again so much for coming on to talk about Goblet of Fire with us.
Thank you so much for having me.
And we will see you next time. Oh, yes. Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, at Fananim Research, FANANIM Research. Anything we've discussed today that you want us to do a footnote about, you can email us at fananimresearch@gmail.com. And the blog and the archive are out there via all the various podcast subscription services and at fantasy-animation.org. We'll see you next time.
Bye.